Ich freue mich außerordentlich, dass wir zu Beginn unserer Ringvorlesung unseren Prorektor für Nachhaltigkeit, meinen Kollegen Kirk von der Juristischen Fakultät begrüßen dürfen. Und ich will einige Worte zu ihm sagen, weil viele kennen ihn, aber wissen vielleicht nicht alles über ihn. Ich will das auch nicht auf alles ausdehnen, weil das ist einfach zu viel. Ich möchte erwähnen, dass er an der Pennsylvania State University studiert hat. Da war ich in den 80er Jahren auch mal. Vielleicht sind wir uns da über den Weg gelaufen, ohne voneinander zu wissen. Aber jetzt wissen wir voneinander. Und wir waren nicht nur an derselben Universität, wir haben auch beim selben Verlag Bücher veröffentlicht, bei Routledge, bei Teil und Francis in ähnlichen Reihen. Das war seine jüngste Publikation, Globalization, Environmental Law and Sustainable Development in the Global South, 2022. Ich kam ein Jahr später. Global South ist auch ein Stichwort, in dessen Rahmen Sie tätig sind, nämlich im Global South Study Center, aber das ist natürlich nicht alles. Von Penn State über die Duquesne University, wo Herr Juncker promoviert hat, ging es dann zum deutschen Recht an die Universitäten Tübingen und Bonn. Aber er hat auch eine immense Praxiserfahrung als Staatsanwalt für das Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection und war das Superior Court oder Supreme Court? Superior Court in Pennsylvania. Das ist ja immerhin schon eine Herausforderung, nicht nur dahin zu kommen, sondern das auch durchzuhalten. An Universitäten hat er an vielen Stellen unterrichtet, in der Open University in Großbritannien, in Dublin. Er war Direktor der internationaler Studienprogramme an der Duquesne University, später auch hier in Deutschland. Seit 2009 ist er Inhaber des Lehrstuhls für US-amerikanisches Recht. Dazu ist auch gerade ganz jüngst ein Buch erschienen bei UTB, US-amerikanische Rechtskultur. Hier in Köln war er Vorsitzender des Prüfungsausschusses des International Master of Environmental Sciences Program, IMES, und mittlerweile der Direktor des Environmental Law Centers. Ich könnte noch einen tieferen Blick in die Publikationen und die Breite dessen, was er uns so geschrieben und gesagt hat, werfen, aber da wir schon so viel Zeit eingebüßt haben oder einbüßen würden, wenn ich hier noch länger rede, gebe ich jetzt das Mikrofon ab und bitte begrüßen Sie unseren Prorektor mit einem herzlichen Applaus.
Okay, ist laut genug, ja? Entschuldigung, darf ich dann hin und her laufen oder muss ich hier stehen? Okay, gut, danke. Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank, Herr Professor Leithold. Ich versuche heute Abend eigentlich als Prorektor, was ein bisschen komisch ist, meinen Vortrag zu halten, weil es interdisziplinär wird. Und ein Vorteil als Prorektor zu arbeiten ist, ich habe die Gelegenheit dann, Leute wie Professor Leithold kennenlernen zu können, was ich normalerweise in der juristischen Fakultät nicht hätten. Also das ist wirklich ein Vergnügen für mich. Wir haben dann schon vorher für diese Ringvorlesung gestimmt, dass ich würde und ich glaube Kate Rigby unsere Vorträge auf Englisch halten würden. Es gibt zwei Gründe dafür. Erstens, weil meine Forschung ist hauptsächlich in englischer Sprache und es ist schwierig und manchmal falsch, einfach alles übersetzen zu haben. Und zweitens, ich bin sicher, dass mit meinen Sprachfehlern und Akzent, Sie würden lieber meine Englisch hören als mein Deutsch. Also Sie können aber gerne Ihre Fragen auf Deutsch stellen und wir können dann später in der deutschen Sprache austauschen. Okay, jetzt geht's los. The title that I gave, From Immigration to Flooding, What Can We Afford, was chosen for this Ringvorlesung for several reasons. One is because these are in fact climate issues, immigration and flooding. People would think of flooding typically as a climate issue, but not immigration so much. And the fact that we have immigration problems, especially on the south of Europe, in Spain, in France, in Italy, is because people in the continent across the water due to climate change, can no longer farm, for instance, and conduct the lives that they would have conducted before. So I put the word climate in there, which was not originally in there, and now I have no battery, because it is a climate issue. The other word that I want to focus on just for a moment before we go forward is the word afford. Das kann ich nicht leisten, because as a habit, a connotation for perhaps the language scholars in the audience, we have allowed the word to shift largely into talking about money. But both in the English language and the German language, leisten and afford are not limited to thinking about money. They have histories that go beyond that. So that's the reading for the reasons for the title there. The next word that I want to look to see what we're doing or not doing is crisis. Are we in a crisis? Well, if we look as lawyers, as I do, at the jurisdictions of the world, both the national and the subnational jurisdictions, we would see that more than 2,000 jurisdictions in 40 countries actually make an official declaration, yes, it's a crisis. We have an emergency. And we've heard that. And the United Nations also has done its own survey on this, and with respondents in a quarter of the world's countries, 64 people reported that they agreed climate is an emergency. If we think about crises, plural, we have had the pandemic recently, the COVID pandemic. We thought it was a crisis, and look what we did. We closed everything. People wore masks, they didn't travel. And if you look at all of those graphs about emissions, you will always see that that was the one period of time when things dropped again. So we are capable now in this century of recognizing a crisis. Why don't we recognize this as a crisis? If you look at the response compared in climate to what we did with COVID, we have wars as crises. No problem. If you look at wars as crises, the same thing happens. All of a sudden, the national legislatures of the world convene, they want to give money, they have big debates about should we send weapons, should we send people, is it a just war? That's a response to a crisis. So we have COVID, we have wars, but how do we respond to climate? Well, we don't seem to be seeing it that way. I'm going to move on then, because this is going to be the theme picture that you might hold in mind. I'll visit it a few times this evening to make some points about it. So we have these crises, and they're not just climate. As Professor Leithold has already mentioned to us, there are other environmental crises as well. We do have biodiversity crisis. In the time that we've been together so far this evening, 2 species have gone extinct. By the time we finish this evening, 5 to 6 species will have gone extinct. That's a crisis as well. In addition to that, all of us sitting here right now have plastics in our body. The research is incomplete as to whether we pass them through our body, because that's how we find that they're in there. In fact, nobody is cutting open any bodies to find them, but they're in human waste right now. And the rate by which they are increasing in human waste is increasing. So we have things other than climate. And the question then is, what do we do with crises? That's the red dot over here to your left. If you think about it historically, and this is where the interdisciplinarity, I hope, comes in for our university. Historically, when we have crises of this type that we might call environmental crises, we would respond by doing scientific research, natural scientific research, and also social scientific research. And when we do that, the people in the natural sciences will often, to remain faithful to their science, insist that we will describe, we will not create values or state values or create an agenda of what people should do. We're describing what the problem is, what the situation is. These would be the goals that we would want to get to. So we want to limit our climate change to 1.5 degrees, we hope. We want to use polymers that are non-petrol polymer chains, which we have, but the petrol industry wants us to use their products, so that gets pushed on us. But we could make them out of plant material as well. And we want to try to reverse systems degradation because most of biodiversity loss is due to habitat loss. It's not due to intentional slaughtering of the species. The next point that we tell ourselves in the process, typically in, let's call ourselves a democracy, is that we say that citizens would vote, that they would tell their legislative body, this is the ideas that we support and we expect you to do something about them. Take action based upon the evidence and our own observations and help us to achieve these goals. The legislative body in response then uses tools, as Professor Leithold has already mentioned, technological tools, economic tools, through legislation, lawmaking. It's a nice story. What results do we have from practicing as a society a story where when we have a crisis and we identify the goals for our solutions, we go through these steps? Let's have a look. The first thing I think we have to ask ourselves, and some of the students in the room work with me and they've seen this before, are humans rational? This structure that we have here is based upon the assumption that we are. In our Western culture, Aristoteles told us 24 centuries ago that in fact we have as our telos, our possibility, if we fully come to our possibility, to be rational, but we're not always rational. And more important, we can't choose to be rational. Because if we could choose to be rational, then the operating system itself would be a rational system, and that would mean we're always rational. So then the question that becomes important for us is, well, if we think rationality will help us to solve these problems, and we can't choose when we are rational, what do we do to put it into play? And this is my operating word for this evening, and Professor Leithold was with us, and Dr. Killian is here as well from the Nachhaltigkeitsbüro for our forum on Monday, and I had a few words to say then. And I tried to introduce the word habitus, because Aristotle would have talked about habitus. Actually, he would have told us that habits are good things, which seems to be a strange thing to us. And we don't talk about establishing habits in a university. We talk about producing rational knowledge and exchanging rational ideas. We make that habit, that's what we do. But in fact, he said that rationality is just not a matter of bad habits, but it's also a matter of pattern behavior from which we learn. Let's look at what we've done in the past with environmental crises and the habits we have established. So environmental law, which is the area when I come from my faculty in which I work, is part of our habit pattern when it comes to environmental problems. Because if we go all the way back to my earlier picture, this is when the legislators step in under our story that citizens have asked them to do something about problems like this. This is a picture from 1979. I find it interesting the word smog was used then, because smog is an acronym in English for smoke plus fog, but it was used obviously in the Ruhrgebiet as well. And there we have the city of New York. And that was considered an obvious problem to the people living there, that they could see that. We needed to scientifically be able to measure it, weigh it, come up with some sort of way of characterizing it, but it didn't take a scientific instrument to see that we've got problems here. We just celebrated Earth Day, Tag der Erde, on Monday this week. And 50 years ago, 54 years ago now, when this happened, the first Earth Day, 20 billion people, let's go back to our story again. You're going to get tired of seeing this, but that's good. If we go back to our story, this was the citizens, based upon the natural sciences and what they could observe, doing something about it, and what they were doing was protesting, because there wasn't something being done about it. Insofar as they did, the legislative bodies, both in the United States and in Germany, responded as we would expect them to, according to the rational story. So we have in 1970, the same year, the Federal Clean Air Act, and we have in 1972, first of all, the Bundesumweltprogramm was put into effect in 1971, and by 1972, very much like the Clean Air Act, we have the Bundesemissionsschutzgesetz. So the response is, let's make a law. That's how we would begin to approach the crisis. I think I've said everything that's on that slide, so I'm going to go forward only to point out that Aristotle's idea, or maybe I should go back for a moment, because he does say, and it's probably easier, none of the technology is working for us tonight. But if you go to the blue, and I'm glad I've color-coded it, you'll see that when Aristotle is writing, he's talking about habit as learning. It improves a person's performance and makes him or her more successful in the quest to achieve a goal. I didn't invent that. It's a translation into English. He was obviously working in ancient Greek, but it was performance to achieve a goal. That's habit. Simply put, one acquires a new ability. So this idea, how do we get these habits if we can't intentionally choose them? For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. You have to think about that for a second. What does that mean? Learning by doing. For example, and of course it's Aristotle writing, so it was only in the male, men become builders by building, musicians become musicians by playing the instrument and practicing, and then he goes through abstractions. So too we become just by doing just acts. We become temperate by doing temperate acts. We become brave by doing brave acts. And to this, I would add, for the theme of our lecture series, we become sustainable by doing sustainable acts. It's not, if it's going to be a habit, it doesn't have to be a process of intentionally foreseen legislation that is then implemented and then we try to get to the goal, but rather the acts that we do. More recently, if you don't want to look back 24 centuries and make any connection, we have just still in this century, he only died recently, Pierre Bourdieu, developed this work further by saying that in sociology, as with Aristotle's idea, when people act, they simultaneously reproduce social structures beyond the individual. So this is what we can add to it in more current time. Okay, now let's see if we can make a rational assessment, to go back to rationality, of something like industrialism. This is the sort of graph that we see so often that makes us not want to look at graphs, because it's not good news, and we're tired of getting such bad news. So the bad news here is as soon as the Industrial Revolution begins, world population growth increases exponentially. And I check this all the time, if you want to. For good reason, I don't trust our technology, so I could have brought up the website for you, but I don't know that it would have worked. But there's a world population counter that's live and running constantly. I would encourage you to look at it. It's a good reminder of the situation in which we are. This was just a few hours ago. We are at 8.1 billion. And look how recently, 23, we were at 8.0, and in 22, we weren't even at 8 billion. So this trend here, this exponential increase, is alarming. But look at the pattern. Now look at the pattern of our carbon dioxide emissions. And you should see, without any great investigative science or quantitative science, it's a very similar pattern that we have there. And we won't go into blaming and naming here who's doing the bad work, but the fact is it simply is the same pattern from industrialism moving on that vertical curve to the billions of tons per year. Now we look at a similar graph, and the similar graph, and there's our Penn State University, because Michael Mann is from Penn State University, the person who invented this idea of the graph, he's talking about temperature. So population, emissions, temperature. Very similar pattern, a little too similar to say that it's just a coincidence. And there's industrialism on the history of us as recognized being human beings. And I put it in this pinky color here because we're not talking about this line or even this line. In the history of human existence, we've only been industrial, that last tiny little sliver there, compared to the rest of our existence as human beings. So sometimes, and I don't like this to sound like doom and gloom, but it often does, people hear this and say, oh, he's another one of these ecologists that wants us to go back to the caves. That's what they see the two possibilities being. It must be just as it is, that's the only way humans can live, or we go back to the caves. That's our only two choices that they can possibly see. Well, we were doing an awful lot between the caves and now, and we didn't have industrialism. So apparently we do have ways of living without living in industrial conditions. And just to make sure that the species issue is mentioned briefly here, these are also worldwide where it's happening. It's not just something that's happening in exotic places, it's happening right here in Europe as well. And the species extinction, same graph. So it's not just a climate thing. If we look at the assessment of whether industrialism rationally has produced good things or bad things, it has produced good things, but it's produced crises as well. We're experiencing these crises. Okay. Even more recently, just last September, in a different way of looking at things, we have these pictures that you might have seen. And look at the timing on this as well. 2009, because this is a new way of doing research. Instead of looking at individual parameters, we look at systems, entire system parameters. And the systems we look to, it's very small for you to read from there, are things like ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol, stratospheric aerosol. This is the ozone problem we had, and we've actually fixed it. It's the only one. Freshwater, land system, biosphere, and climate change. In 2009, we were beyond the limit on 3 of them. By 2015, on 4 of them, and just last year, on 6 of the 9 measurable systems boundaries. So if we go back to whether we are in systems crisis, and not simply by picking the ones that would demonstrate there is a crisis, systems science would say that we are as well. Now we come to my word of Ford, and we have a few minutes to spend with Duden or Webster to talk about this. So as I pointed out, that historically we do understand, and this is the first usage that Duden gives us, it doesn't talk about financial ability. It in fact talks about Zustande bringen. Webster, the ability to bear without serious detriment. This is why I use this word afford. What can we afford? It's not going back to the caves. That's not the only alternative. What can we tolerate without serious detriment? Only second in both languages does it come to finances to be able to bear the cost of. How did we get to the point when we think of the phrase, what can I afford, that we only think of financial affordability? Habit. It's the connotation that we use the most often. Think of Aristotle's point. If you use it, it creates the habit, and it becomes the system by which you believe things are described. So here we are again with our picture. And this is the question I want to ask then. If we inject habit into this, the way in which humans behave, and the first word for Professor Leithold's Ringvorlesung is Umdenken. And part of Umdenken is to focus perhaps on, at a university of all places, behavior based on habit and not based upon what we do by description. This story here I'm going to comment upon in a moment. Professor Leithold had also mentioned that in our forum on Monday we had talked about economics, and we talked about technology as possible tools, and they are here as well. These are tools to change behavior. But unlike those pictures from the smog alert in the Ruhrgebiet or the air pollution in New York City, when the response was to establish legislation, and that response was to limit economic activity very often, those whose economic activity has been limited is the empire that now strikes back. They have recognized that people are going to demand that there be legislation for clean air, clean water, a clean and healthy environment. And so we have a product that we have to deal with called denialism or misinformation. And we have to deal with that in politics, and particularly in these politics. So right here in this building upstairs a few years back, we had a guest, and Professor Leuschner spent her entire evening talking about denialism to distraction, reflections on industry's new strategies against climate action. You'd say, well, it's a focus on economics. It's not a focus on disinformation or misinformation. Let's find out. What will economics is a habitus as well. If we think about it, we have these terms for which there is not evidence, a free market, but we have subsidies and taxation, so we use free market as a habitus without having the evidence for it. We talk about the invisible hand guiding the market. That's an invention of habit. What we found, this is the evidence that would support Professor Leuschner's book, what we found beginning in 2017 by an institute called the Climate Accountability Institute was that just 100 companies in the world, which are referred to as the major emitters of carbon equivalents, are responsible for 71% of the emissions since 1988. So you can imagine there are thousands and thousands, possibly 1 million different emitters in the world. But if we're just going to look at measuring volumes, just 100 companies, it's a nice easy number to remember, are responsible for 71%. Now, go back to the fairy tale. What should happen at that point? You say, you should emit less than the 71% that you're doing. This is a health problem, this is an environmental problem. In support of Professor Leuschner's thesis, what we find instead was the fossil fuel companies spent $2.6 billion US on what? To control the narrative around it and blame the individuals. It's you turning the heat up too much in the winter and you driving your car that are the climate problem. And yet, unfortunately, because they believe in the story of rational policy making as well, here's our legislators, the IPCC itself, the International Panel on Climate Change, who has great influence on states of the world, said that the way in which we have to fix this is the policymakers, politicians making law, the policymakers need to regulate it. So we are still back in this model. This is what we think we're going to do to address these crises. The update in 2024 for the Climate Accountability Institute points out that the same thing is happening, and now we can even narrow it down to 57 companies producing 80%. So the trend there is consistent. It wasn't a statistical outlier from 2017. And the database then points out that this is just the way that this data is collected. We'll go past that. This is a summary way of thinking about it. Since 1988, the fossil fuel industry has doubled its contribution to global warming. And if you look at that, that's compared to the 237 years of industrialism prior to that. So again, we have this vertical growing of what is happening with emissions. And again, since 1988, which is a much longer time frame than the other statistic used, half, that's not what we looked at before, half of global industrial pollution is just 25 corporate and state producers. State must be on there because we should not forget here in Germany that in states like Nigeria, 51% of all oil production is state-owned. So even when we look at other states of the world, oil production can be a state production, even though it looks very much like private production as well. Part of this response that doesn't fit the narrative we give ourselves is greenwashing. And greenwashing can be intentional misinformation. If you go to Reva, it's hard not to buy a product that says that it's bio and fair trade and everything else, but it's not very strongly regulated to know exactly what that is. That's one form of greenwashing. Another would be what the fossil fuel industry has done, and that was purposely to establish think tanks and institutes to produce information contrary to what the rest of the scientific world has said. That is harsh greenwashing. But another type of greenwashing, because the people who are interested in spending the $2.6 billion US to get us not to take the action according to the story, also have this idea that they have to appeal to investors because these are capital stock holding companies. And a nice thing after the post-COVID world is how many meetings you can lurk on just by signing up. So I've made this a little habit of my own, is that I join stockholder meetings or I join conferences from the perspective of businesses as to what they want to do, and this is a theme. We need to tell the investors that the product is green. Not that the product is green, we need to tell the investors that the product is green so that the habit continues of the investment, but we recognize that the demands of the persons is that it has to be green in some way. So this is what I would call the fairy tale, the Märchen, about how that little stripe is, that we start off with citizens vote and then politicians are elected based on our voting. And the politicians, which is the IPCC wants them to do, make legislation, and that is either making us happy or unhappy, and then we vote again. And this is sort of the way we talk about the political lawmaking cycle for children. However, if we look at just Exxon, we find that between 1977 and 2003, they had the best climate modeling of anyone in the world. No state in the world, not Germany, not Brazil, not the United States, not the Russian Federation. Nobody had better modeled climate change than Exxon itself, but it didn't tell anybody. In fact, it did the opposite. It hid the information. And this isn't just my opinion, this is by analyzing it that was done at Harvard University. So what we have to add to our story that we tell ourselves here is that in addition to the sort of children's tale, is that this is where the $2.6 billion is being spent, that lobbying is occurring, so that these politicians making legislation aren't coming directly from the citizens' votes and the ideas that they want. If you look at oil companies alone, over roughly the last 3 decades, 5 major American oil companies spent $3.6 billion, not on lobbying, on advertising. And insofar as they did, look at the curve again. It's incredible how these line up. As a result, if we're going to complete our legal political cycle here, not only do we have to include lobbying over here, we have to put money in advertising over here to actually begin to explain how is our nice, progressive, rational arrow that tells the story about how we describe the problem and then go to our lawmakers to make legislation about it and then enforce the law and achieve our goal. How is that not happening? What are the interferences with that? Very recently, also at Harvard University, David Arkush has suggested, and he says litigation belongs in the political circle as well, and he said we should recognize that criminal conduct is what it is, and we don't give people a free ride just because they happen to be in a business. Now, of course, there are many businesses, the majority of businesses, that are good citizens, and they're making useful products, and they are not the problem. But these are the problem. And insofar as this is the case, and this is a critique on our own work on the law faculty, he says, but we teach law with this idea that a corporation, it can't be criminal because criminals have to have intentionality. They have to be able to have the intent to create the act that harms people. And so if they can't have intentionality, they can't be criminal, we can't prosecute them for acts that harm the whole public, which is what all other crimes are. And he says it's just economic efficiency that we're teaching or actually practicing in law. So we can go back to the arrow once again. When we get to that block that says what legislation does, until and unless he says we can say that there's criminal activity, we are just working with economic efficiency. So there's the last thing that we have to add. And you may know about this, but just a few years back, there was a private foundation, a Verändern Stiftung in the Netherlands called Urgenda. And the people of the Urgenda Foundation decided that the Netherlands was doing nothing for the Netherlands to comply with the 2015 Paris Agreement. So they took a legal action against their own state. And just 2 weeks ago, if you were paying attention, the European Court of Human Rights found that Switzerland had been sued by a group of Senioren, Klimasenioren, they call themselves, because they said their particular harm is that at an advanced age, they are more susceptible to the harms of climate, and that makes it a special harm for them. And they had been turned away twice on technical legal issues, and this time the European Court of Human Rights agreed with them. They have successfully taken action against Switzerland for failing to protect them. So the litigation that has occurred in this strange way that we tell this story now is litigation not against the people causing the problem, it's against the state for failing to what it does do on that nice line that we have, where we tell ourselves that rationally the state will respond to the citizen's interest, which is based upon what natural science has told them. Okay, so the interdisciplinary issue, you've heard from all these different things now. We have to wonder psychologically, how do we react to crises? Natural sciences describe the crises. Political science gets involved here, law gets involved here, economics gets involved here, and then we have to ask ourselves, putting this together through multiple disciplines, how do we get to the crisis? If it doesn't lead to action, people become frustrated. Following this rational pattern, this way that we believe we produce information, we produce knowledge, and we act based upon it, they become frustrated. I've gone through the exercise of asking audiences before, but since we'll have questions later, many people said, I have no idea what this was supposed to mean. How could throwing paint on the statue in front of this building have anything to do with fixing climate? And I would suggest to you it's not a rational behavior, but that's also part of how it is that we achieve new habits. It was to demonstrate that this nice, rational stripe that we show isn't working for these people. The same thing happens with people who glue themselves to the street or who go to painting galleries and throw tomato sauce on the paintings, and people say, I can't see the connection between those acts and the goal that the people want to achieve, because this is how the thing is supposed to work. If these are your goals and this is what you want to achieve, you should be going through these steps to do so. And I suppose when it's working, let's go back to the pictures from 1970s, that's okay. But when it's not working, then people don't just sit at home, they do something, even as irrational as it is. So our job, looking back at it, according to Aristotle, is to make the habits, the irrational activity, patterns for positive things. And this brings us to universities. The fact that universities can actually achieve patterns for positive things by repeating doing them has been known by primary school educators for 2 centuries. That when you teach small children, you don't rationally explain to them what to do. You go through the exercise with them, and they establish patterns of behavior. At our university here, every winter, we have something we call the Winter Conference. And it is intentionally interdisciplinary. And just a few years ago at our 15th meeting, our topic was the interconnected climate risks in health sciences, environmental sciences, and education. And what we started with during that conference, this was actually Professor Reza from Koblenz. He said, he's a psychologist, he talked about cognitive dissonance. That we are presented with facts and we don't make a rational response to them. And he talked about the fact that we know what we're doing in this regard. And then we had Professor Bush, who is an assistant professor of science, technology, and mathematics education, talking about teaching children. And she, in her research, which is published in the International Journal of Science Education, had separated out what she calls science discourse in working with children and social discourse. And she would say science discourse, think about how we talk about climate change, is in the future, it's a global problem, physical Earth systems, we talked about it earlier tonight. Social discourse, on the other hand, impacts on human systems, not physical Earth systems, is local and is now. And by separating out the discourse in that regard, she had a little questionnaire here. So what we would assume, if the job of the university, the job of education with multiple disciplines is to follow the line of rationality, well, we can go with a raising of hands. These are the 4 categories that were presented to the children in the survey, and not just very young children, they were all the way up to secondary school. And the goal, once again, was climate change action. I didn't invent that. I invented my slide, but it happens to mirror her work. And she said, what would make you do something? What would make you change your habits, change your patterns of behavior to achieve climate change? These were the categories she gave her people. Which one do you think was first? Knowledge, social norms, I've tipped it off a bit with what she said earlier, certainty, which is often talked about, efficacy simply meaning is it wirksam. Which one do you think most people say is what would make them take action? Yes. Yes, okay. The story that we would tell ourselves typically is it should be information. Remember the arrow. So we see a crisis, we get natural science to describe what the problem is, that's information, and that should drive us to do something. But in fact, her survey showed exactly as you said, that social norms are the #1 response when you ask people, young people, what they would do to take climate action. Knowledge, what we do at the university, or we think we do most of the time, was the least effective thing. Let's go back to our psychologist. So that is an educationalist. That was her work in our conference. And the work in psychology also showed that social identity was in fact how it was in his work in psychology that he finds that people are more likely to take action for climate change. Whether mostly they identify themselves as individuals or as members of a society. And he has all the psychological tools for testing those two distinctions. Specifically, he talks about world citizens, global identity, and sustainability action, and he measures this. So what he finds that the efficacy beliefs, but social norms and identity were the most important drivers. So that's his summary. This is not mine. I just borrowed his slide. This is Professor Reza working in psychology in Koblenz. And then finally, we can just look briefly at one example from epidemiology. In epidemiology, this again goes back to a colleague in the United States. She was dealing again with denialism, and she was talking about how it is that denialism has effect on what people will actually do for their own health or what they will do to support other person's health when it comes to health decisions. Remember the masks from COVID? Still to this day, I think that people believe when you wear a mask, you protect yourself. And yet what everybody told us in public health is that you wear the mask to protect the other person wears the mask to protect you, because it's actually not very good with the air coming in, but it's good at stopping the air from going out. And yet, by looking at that sort of behavior, she found that a strong part there was rejecting information that challenges a belief, not information or science, but a belief. So, back to what I would do to put this together. In education, in psychology, in epidemiology, climate mitigation is more likely to occur to identity, the idea that we are part of a society and not an individual, social discourse, not scientific discourse, a worldview about how you see the norms of the world, and the social norms. And as our colleague just said, these are all social categories that are produced based on habits, not based upon information. So recalling that Aristotle said that our rationality is present, it's our telos, but we're not always rational. We can't choose to be rational. We must therefore establish habits that would make us rational. And that brings us to my final point for this evening, and that's what we can afford. We very often hear about carbon footprints, and you can look at your carbon footprint, you can calculate it. There are loads of applications for doing that. But carbon footprints, let's think of now, because we are accustomed to saying was können wir uns leisten, as though that's talking about money. What can we afford? Let's make it an analogy to money. So your carbon footprint would be like your monthly bank statement. How much am I spending? How much did I spend? But what we want to know is how much can you spend? if we want to achieve those goals. And we don't do that very often. It's calculable, it's approximate, but so is your bank statement when you're trying to determine how much money you will need. So by using a comparison like that, the difference between a footprint and a budget, we can develop a habitus regarding carbon for our own practices in the same way that we would develop a habitus regarding how we spend our money. So, doing that, we could ask the same then about carbon, we could ask it about plastics, we could ask it about the so-called forever chemicals, the PFAs, because those are crises problems as well. And then we have to look at, so how does that fit in with all these things that we would call habits? We have technological habits. We have legal habits. I've talked about that. We have consumerist and money habits. Our Minister for Environment and Economics doesn't believe in individual action in this regard, though. And he says he's concentrating rather not on individual, and he uses the word budget. And he doesn't mean money budgets. He is talking about carbon budgets. This is an interview with Panorama, and he said he'd rather look at greenhouse gases by looking at renewable energy. There's our technology habit. And looking at production for our products. There's our consumer habit. We can use economics as well and simply either make them more expensive. There's our economic habit, or forbid them. There's our legal habit. These are all habits that we have established as the way that we can go about trying to do this. But he doesn't want the carbon budget to happen. So you can do this. I was going to try to do it with you, but I think I correctly didn't trust our technology, as we saw earlier this evening. And by not trusting the technology, you can do it on your own. Just as you find carbon footprint applications, you can easily find carbon budget applications. And I would encourage you, let's go back to what Aristotle and eventually Pierre Bourdieu said, if you get in the practice of doing that, the next time you say or you hear, das kann ich mich nicht leisten, maybe you actually think, oh, you're talking about that would be too much carbon. In the past month alone, this to me is, well, I'm laughing, so obviously I find it to be funny. I was invited to go to New York to speak about sustainability. One talk to fly to New York. And as I was invited to do this, I thought, do I really have to say the obvious that I don't think that's a sustainable thing to do? Maybe we could have a Zoom or something. And eventually it was talked about, yeah, this is probably not worthwhile. Just last week, I was invited to go to Peru, again, to talk about this. And when I told my colleague who runs an energy institute in Peru, I said, I can't afford the carbon. That was the phrase I used. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I have an approximate idea of how much carbon I'm using this year, and I'm beyond what my limit is. So I love Peru. I like the people, I like the food. It's wonderful to get into the countryside, but sorry, I'm not coming, even though you're going to pay for the whole thing, which is his response. He said, 5 days, 4 nights, flight, all paid. I said, but I can't afford it, because I can't afford the carbon. And that was a different way, a different habit to establish about how we think of what we can afford. So you can do a carbon budget. Here's an example. I made a screenshot, not trusting that we'd be able to do one live. So you can look at country carbon budgets, and from a country carbon budget, and they exist in any language you choose. German would exist as well. But in English, I could put Germany in. And then you can decide, well, I decided 1.5 because I'm an optimist, that we could stay at 1.5. And then I decided that the probability, that's as high as it will let you go, 83%. You can't put 100% in there. So with 83% probability to get the 1.5, here's the outcome it gives us. Global fossil carbon, because there's the difference between agriculture and building and so forth. Per person, I've underlined it for us. Per person, fossil carbon budget, this is over 10 years, because that's what we're working with 2030, in Germany, would then be 3.418 tons per year. So what you have in your bank account, what we all have in our bank account is 418 tons per year. And now you can look and see how much am I actually using and compare it to that, and you would come up with the same ability that you have when you look each month, or maybe you look at it more often, how much money do I have in the bank and what can I afford to do? And this would be a way as a habit to establish a way of talking about what it is that we're doing in response to crises that doesn't fit the pretense of having a rational arrow from left to right between identifying crisis and getting an outcome. To see where we are in Germany on this, because as our colleague from the economics faculty pointed out on Monday, Germany as a country is flat in increasing its emissions, but if we do it per capita, because that's how we think about our budgets, we get a slightly different picture of this. So you might remember during the during the economic crisis that ended in approximately 2014, some clever people had invented the idea that Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, if we put them together, were pigs. The pig states, because they were economically irresponsible. Let's switch from talking about economics to carbon and look and see the same countries again. If we look at Germany, 7.72, we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions per capita in metric tons per year per person. Now let's look at the pigs. Portugal, 7.71. Ireland and Italy, 9.23, 6.68. Greece, 5.06, and Spain, 4.62. What we find, in fact, is the only countries that, if we look at carbon budget as the way we're establishing our habit, India, often blamed, China, often blamed, are not pigs per capita. They're actually doing quite well. And when we consider what China is producing for us, there's something sitting on every bench in this room from China. I'm sure this is made in China. This is not that much of a problem. The Americans, always looked upon as being probably one of the worst operators, and they are in fact, the Russian Federation, no, Luxembourg. Luxembourg. The per capita carbon budget of Luxembourg is about the same as the United States, and the Russian Federation is not far behind, okay? So, a different way of establishing a habit of understanding what we're doing is to look at this idea that Dr. Habeck doesn't want us to look to, and that's the individual carbon budget. I'll skip over this one. Okay, so the usual levers of political action, our blue band again. Environmentalists have argued, and this is environmental civil disobedience, argue that we are undergoing an environmental crisis. The usual levers of political action: voting, calling your representatives, litigate, exactly what we looked at on the arrow. Have been ineffective in bringing about the change in individual value systems, social institutions, and political attitudes that represent concern for the natural environments. And so we have things like protest in Lützerath. We have things like people gluing themselves to the street, of painting Hubertus Magnus. But there's a history to this working as well. Going back to the United States for a moment, the number of persons who are actually active for women to get the vote in the United States, active. Remember, 20 million, 10% of the American public supported Earth Day. Only 1% supported women getting the right to vote. And yet, they were able to do that. Recent Yale survey said that 40% of Americans would practice civil disobedience, which would look like this, or Albertus Magnus, or tomato sauce on a painting, to get what they want in that regard. So my conclusion then is that, as an interdisciplinary idea at a university, where we are, this is the story that we typically tell ourselves about what we would do to achieve the solution to crises once identified, after we have identified these goals. We would use the natural sciences to describe them. We would use politics and sociology to tell legislators to take action based upon it. The legislators would use economics and laws to change behavior, but we haven't reached the goals, and we've been trying it for a long time. So what I would suggest is the practice is to establish the habitus, and my only example for you this evening is the carbon budget, not a carbon footprint, the carbon budget. Find out what your carbon budget is. Ask yourself, What is your plastics budget? What is your forever chemicals budget? All of these things about individuals. Because as our newest colleague on the philosophy faculty here, Professor Claudia Blosser says, when it comes to ethics, it can actually make you happy. We don't talk about that at the university very often either, that you would study at the university to become happy. Sounds ridiculous. But she says that personal ethics and carrying out your personal ethic under a principled system is actually a way of achieving the telos that Aristotle is talking about. And with that, I will finish what I have to present for this evening. I thank you for your attention. And especially since we moved rooms here, I think we managed to do that quite well anyway. And if Professor Leithold will tolerate it, I will be happy to take questions. Thank you.